Okay, here we go. I will talk today about processes of migrants network embedding, questioning the assumption of the individual capacity to act in integration debates. Migration is on the rise since decades, although proportionally to the world's population size, it is actually quite stable. This is different for Europe, where since the 90s, the net migration rate exceeds natural change, and thus migration is also proportionally growing. For example, Germany's population size has been relatively stable, as we can see here at the right-hand side of the graph in the blue line. But the proportion of migrants has more than doubled in 30 years. The steepest increase has been observed over the last 5 years, with the so-called European refugee crisis. Spain, where this research was conducted, has septupled its migration rate between 1990 and 2010, but had a negative migration rate in the 5 years preceding the European refugee crisis due to the economic crisis that hit Spain very hard. With an unemployment rate of almost 25%, both migrants and young and highly educated people left Spain to seek work in other places. The growing migration rates in Europe have been accompanied by an increasingly negative public perception of migration. First of all, media attention has grown all over Europe, and it's predominantly negative, as we can see over here. Second, migration is also increasingly politicized, but the level of politicization is not related to objective pressures, such as the unemployment rate or the number of migrants in a certain place and time. These negative tendencies also affect integration policies. The competence on integration lies with the member states of the European Union, but the European Union has also formulated a set of common basic principles on migrant integration in 2004, which reflects a common view on which they reached agreement. And in these common basic principles, it says that it sees integration as a dynamic, long-term and continuous two-way process of mutual accommodation. It is thus acknowledged explicitly that integration is a two-way process that involves both migrants and native-born citizens in the receiving society. Integration is assumed to be important in multiple domains, such as employment, education, access to services and institutions, and the one that we are going to look at more deeply in this presentation, which is a frequent interaction between immigrants and member state citizens. With the increased problematization of migrants, the meaning of integration has shifted. So in most policies, the individual migrant is seen as the main actor of integration who has the duty to integrate, and failing to do so is now met with punitive measures in line with our neoliberal system. Migrants should demonstrate their willingness and ability to integrate. Here we can clearly see the assumption of individual agencies. Migrants are assumed to be in control of their level of integration, and this assumption actually contrasts with the formal acknowledgement of the EU that integration is a two-way process, not only involving adaptation of migrants, but also of the native-born citizens. In practice, integration policies are defined by the receiving state only and implemented by the receiving state, and the burden of integration is put on the migrants. But how realistic is this assumption? In our research, we do not focus on all domains of integration, but we focus specifically on social integration, which we can study with a social network approach. Social integration can be defined as the extent to which individuals form meaningful social relations with locals and the quality of those relationships. And we can approach this dimension with the concept of embeddedness, or as a process, network embedding. This dimension is also recognized as important by the EU, which said that integration is not only about learning the language, finding a house, or getting a job. It is also about playing an active role in one's local, regional, and national community, about developing and sustaining real people-to-people contacts. Social integration has often been framed theoretically with a social capital perspective. Social capital, as you well know, is the ability to secure benefits by virtue of membership in social networks. And in particular, social capital research makes a distinction between social bonds and social bridges. So bonding social capital has been defined as the resources embedded in relationships within densely connected, homogeneous communities, whereas bridging social capital has been defined as the resources embedded in the more heterogeneous ties that cut across such communities. You can see this in this graph, where the black ties are bonding social capital and the green ties are bridging social capital. However, in migration research, the distinction has often been understood as same origin versus other origin relationships. And in particular, those bridging relationships, the cross-origin relationships, are thought to be important for social integration, although more recently researchers have also shown that bonding relationships are as important, or same origin relationships are as important for one's settlement. Interestingly, social capital theories tend to adopt a similar assumption of individual agency. Both Bourdieu and Lin speak of rational actors who invest in networks with the purpose of reaping future benefits. Networks are thus the product of investment strategies, of deliberative efforts, and the interest is not in how they are formed, but what they can provide. As a consequence, more attention has been devoted to the consequence of ties than to how ties are created. And this is a pity, because if we are interested in processes of social integration, we want to know how those ties are formed, how social integration is producing. Or relative lack of knowledge about how migrants become locally embedded is also due to the lack of longitudinal data on personal networks of migrants. Usually networks are studied cross-sectionally, and the variability in composition is then related to variables such as age, years of residence, the country of origin, linguistic ability, or education. And this is unfortunate because it reinforces the assumption of individual agency, as now it is the individual variables that predict social integration. In sum, we do not know well what the process of social integration looks like over time. There are nonetheless several theoretical expectations regarding integration as a whole. The classical assumption was one of linear and unidirectional development, where first-generation migrants were expected to integrate more and more as a function of time. Harold Gans modified this assumption with his bumpy line assumption, where migrants would still integrate more and more in society, but it would go with ups and downs. Glaser and Moynihan, on the other hand, assumed that integration would follow a halted line, where it increases until it reaches a certain upper limit or a glass ceiling, where first-generation migrants, at least, would not be able to integrate more. And later models foresaw multiple modes of assimilation, where, for example, one trajectory would be the classical assumption of linear integration. Another mode would be selective integration, in which migrants would integrate, for example, in terms of the labor market or education, but not in cultural terms or social terms. And a third mode would be one in which migrants integrate into a parallel society. So these are theoretical ideas about the processes of integration, but what do migrants' processes of network embedding and disembedding look like in real life? And what factors weigh in on the direction or the depth of integration? Those are the questions that we wanted to answer. And to do so, we did some research. So we collected data based on 3 research projects. In the first project in 2004 to 2006, approximately 300 transnational migrants in Barcelona were interviewed, plus another 200 in the US. And they were from Argentina, the Dominican Republic, Morocco, Senegal, and Gambia. In 2007-2008, 77 of them were re-interviewed. And then again, 4 or 5 years later, 28 informants were re-interviewed, plus others of a different research project. And so we have 77 people for whom we have 2 or 3 waves of data. And we will be looking at these people in this presentation. We used a free list name generator to elicit a list of 45 network members per person. Particularly, we asked them to nominate 45 people that they knew and who know them by sight or by name, who they had contacted in the last 2 years and who they could contact again if they wanted to. We also asked them to include at least the people that they felt emotionally close to and the people that they see a lot. with this fixed high number of persons, what we intended to do is capture a little bit bigger part of the social network. So often social network surveys, they capture, for example, the 3 to 5 most intimate relationships a person has. And this is not really a helpful approach for looking at social integration, because if you're asked to nominate just a few ties, then it is likely that you will nominate those people that are most important to you, most durable connections, such as your parents or your partner. And maybe that doesn't change a lot over time, but that doesn't mean that you haven't become more integrated over time, right? So we need to look at these larger networks if we want to understand the process of embedding. After eliciting a list of network members, we also asked respondents to report about the attributes of network members, such as the country of origin and residence, the type of relationship, the emotional closeness they felt with each person, and the relationship duration in years. And finally, to visualize network structure, we also asked whether each of these persons was related to each of the other persons. So in waves 2 and 3, we did this again, and only afterwards did the interviewers and respondents compare the new list of nominees with the older list in order to identify which people were repeated and which people were new. And this allows us to actually compare snapshots of the network over time to detect changes. We also added semi-structured interviewing, more open interviewing, to discuss the changes in the networks with the informants and ask about their meaning and their interpretation of these changes. And this was very helpful for understanding what happened in the networks in the meantime between the two snapshots. To give you an understanding of the type of data that we collected, I will present 2 cases to you. These 2 cases have been selected to represent together some of the transversely emerging themes. After describing these 2 cases, I will then describe the overall results. So the first case is Elena. Elena is a young Argentinian woman who fell in love with David, a Spanish man, and came to Spain to live with him. She married him, and at the first interview, she was less than 5 years in Spain. She was unemployed at the time and had just had a baby. In her first interview, her network looked like this. So you can see that each node is one of the 45 network members she mentioned. She's not depicted in the network herself because she is connected to everybody else, so it's redundant to put her in the network. Nonetheless, the colors and the size of the nodes give some details about her relationships with them. So the colors indicate the relationship that she had with each of these persons. For example, the green nodes are family members, the red node is the spouse, etc. And the size of the node indicates the emotional closeness she felt toward them. So the bigger nodes are the ones that she felt closer to. The edges represent relationship that the informant perceived between the network members, and this is thus her graph. So what we can see in the first interview in 2006 is that her husband, the red node, and 2 Argentinian friends living in Barcelona formed the core of her network. They were in the center and were connected with all of the other groups in the network. What we further see is that she mentions quite a number of people who are either from Argentina or live in Argentina. The people who live in Argentina are the squares, and there are actually only 9 of the 45 people she mentioned. So her network is basically local. What is also interesting is this enormous group of in-laws that she had. She felt close to 12 people, or relatively close to 12 people. We could say that she had a full embeddedness in the local family. Furthermore, she had some friends from her Catalan language class and also some friends of her husband in the network. So she was actually quite dependent on her husband in this first moment because of all the in-laws and the friends of her husband that figured in her network. 2 years later, we spoke with Elena again, and again we can see the same 3 people at the core of her network. Furthermore, we can see that the network changed quite a bit. So if you look at this inserted graph over here, you can see which nodes have changed. Those are the white nodes, and which nodes are constant across time. Those are the red nodes. And so we can see that about 60% of the network had changed and 40% was stable. And we now see many more network members of Argentina, not only the strong ties that she nominated again, but also quite a number of people that she didn't feel that close with. So what was interesting is that Elena was struggling at the time. As a mother, she was disappointed with the help that her in-laws gave her with raising her toddler. So you can see she kicked out most of the in-laws from her network. And there's just 4 of them left. Also, she was frustrated with her with not being able to find a job because her credentials were not recognized. So she couldn't work in the field that she normally worked in. And also she was frustrated with needing Catalan for finding a job because everyone speaks Spanish, she said. So she also had this feeling of missing Argentina, and you can see this also in her network. So she hadn't been to Argentina in quite a while because it's expensive to travel to Argentina, and she missed especially her mother. She said, every time I see my mother older, it is harder for me to leave her behind. And well, she had been talking with David about living there in Argentina, and therefore she also now includes this tie, this blue note, which was her former boss, because by keeping this contact a bit alive, she kept the door to remigration open. Okay, so we can see now many more transnational ties, many less local ties, and also less family ties. Again, 4 years later, almost 5 years later, we talked to her again, and again, the husband and the 2 Argentinian friends are at the center of her network. You can see now, I must tell, a lot of these purple nodes. And this is because in the 3rd wave, we added the category friend. So before we didn't use that category, and the 3rd wave we did. And just therefore she now indicates some people as friends that before she used other categories such as known since childhood, etc. If we look again at which size was stable, it's about 40% that was stable, 60% that changed. But what we can see is that now she has less Argentinian members in her network, but the people less in the 2nd wave, more than in the 1st wave. But the people that she mentioned are basically quite strong ties overall. Also, we can see here this whole new group of ties. And this is interesting because she now had a 2nd child, but what really changed her social life was that her 1st child went to school. And so she met all the other parents daily at school. She took coffee with them every week and also arranged play dates with the kids. So she got really integrated in this local school network. And we can see that from the category she used to describe them, which is friends. And also the emotional closeness she felt them. She felt quite close to most of the people in this network. So what we can see over here is that the core of the network didn't change. So if we would look at core networks, there would not have been no change at all. The rest of the network actually changed quite a bit, but not in a linear way. Like the first moment we had a few Argentinian members, the second moment, a lot of them, and the third moment, again, a little bit less people from Argentina and more local people. And moreover, the first moment she had quite a lot of local people, but was quite dependent on her husband, while at the third moment, she had actually constructed this network of her own. Okay, that was Elena. Let's now go to the second case, which is Khaled. Khaled is a Moroccan man, 18 years old at the first interview, and he moved to Spain as a teenager with his parents and siblings to a town where there was a lot of immigration. So at the first moment that we interviewed him, he was just out of school and working in a restaurant in the neighborhood. And this is network. So what we can see is that he has these two clusters that are loosely related to each other. At the left hand, we can see Moroccan-born relatives, neighbors, a schoolmate, and one Spanish-born co-worker, this one over here. And the other hand, we can see the Spanish-born bosses, colleagues, and people from the neighborhood, because his work was also in the neighborhood. So that was his network. So a little bit more family and neighborhood-based, and a little bit more work-based on the other hand. And it was mostly local, except for two relatives who had recently moved from Spain to another European countries. They are the triangles in here, and one person who lived in Morocco. He had a lot of family members in Morocco, but he didn't mention them in his network at the first time point. So 3 years later, Khaled worked long shifts for another employer at night, 6 days a week. And the turnover in his network was also about 62%. So, well, basically a bit the same as Elena's network, but we can see that the network is now a little bit denser, maybe because he mentioned more family members. We can also see that some other family members had moved to the same European country where these people had moved to before, but they still came by every time they went to Morocco. So, you know, Catalonia is on the way. So he saw them yearly. And then 4.5 years later, Khaled was married to Munia. He had just married, and they married in Morocco. She still lived there. And so what we see in his network is now this whole cluster of family members in Morocco, and also her family. And these two families got to know each other. So it's actually quite dense. Now, of course, it was also related to the fact that he just went there, he just married. So all these family members were very cognitively very present in his network. And it may be that if we interviewed him 3 months later, for example, it would have been a bit more like in 2008. So Khaled worked for the same employers at that time. And these people were also still in the network here below. And they still were, yeah, a little bit more integrated with his family members at that time. So what we can see is that gradually there is a larger presence of family, also due to this marriage, and also a higher embeddedness of the work context within the family network. So despite Khaled's household migration and emplacement in a town with considerable migration, his network had 17 Spanish-born people in wave 1 when he just graduated in high school, and was actually quite local throughout. But over time, the network also became more work and family centered. Okay, so neither of the two cases shows a linear tendency toward increased local embedding or decreased transnational embedding, or as classical assimilation theory would have predicted. Rather, Elena's embeddedness is fluctuating over time. Her local embeddedness was seemingly integrated first, but uneven and highly dependent on her husband, then weaker in wave 2 and much more solid in wave 3. Khaled's local embeddedness was strong throughout, but he had a stronger family presence over time. These changes responded to structural conditions, for example, the inability to work in her field, as it was Elena's case, and just to find work and have work colleagues in her network. Also to life events, for example, marriage, new jobs, child's transition to school, and to temporal events, right? The current, just having been in Morocco had affected also the network of Khaled. And what we can see is that these networks show a great complexity in terms of their evolving morphology and the micro-mechanisms that guide the dynamics. So let's now look at these transversally emerging themes for all the 77 cases, just summarizing them. First of all, we saw that relationship had a high turnover, but it was actually not unusually high compared to non-migrants. So we saw that about 3/5 of all relationships observed at any point in time was not mentioned again one time point later. However, that doesn't mean that people are making all these new relationships all the time. Rather, they were like reactivated relationships, as the duration that they knew these people exceeded the time interval between the two interviews. And of course, there were also some new ties involved. Also, we can see that patterns of embedding were highly individualized. Just as we saw with Elena and Khaled, every network is a small world. And well, we could maybe, if we look at the average picture, there was a tendency perhaps towards greater integration, local integration on the long run. So what we could see is that 1 in 5 ties were with Spanish-born people in wave 1. But if we look at the newly nominated people, that was 1 in 3 ties. So this suggests that maybe over time, the embeddedness within Spain would be great. But again, there was so much variation between the networks that it was hard to actually find anyone who had that precise pattern or that precise tendency that the average represents. However, although people use these same two meeting mechanisms, the consequences or the results of these two meeting mechanisms could be entirely different based on the initial placement in society. So let me explain this a moment. Let's think of a hypothetical Argentinian migrant who we represent by a yellow note over here. There he goes. And before he migrates, he only knows one person, this person over here, the dark blue note, who is another migrant. And the rest of the people in his network are or migrants or native-born people. Okay, so our Argentinian migrant over here also finds work and in the primary labor market, and also starts to live in a mixed neighborhood over here. And so he is starting to meet new people, first of all, via transitivity, by meeting up with the friends of his friend, and then at work and in the neighborhood. And so his eventual network is quite mixed, actually. It consists of both migrants and native-born people. But if we do the same thing for the other 3 groups that we had data of, the Dominicans, the Moroccans, and the Senegalese people, the picture was quite different. So again, we place here the migrants, who only knows one person again. But this person only knows other migrants. Also, our migrant has found work in the secondary labor market where mostly other migrants are working, and he starts to live in a neighborhood that is mostly inhabited by other migrants. So now he does the same thing. Also, he meets up with friends of friends, and he meets people at his work and also in the neighborhood. And in the end, his network is completely segregated. Okay, it only consists of fellow migrants. So in societies with a dual labor market and segregated neighborhoods and sociability, the same meeting mechanisms, social vocae and transitivity, helped some people become embedded in networks with natives, namely to integration, and others to networks of co-ethnics or parallel societies to segregation, right? This would also happen in super diverse contexts, of course, where there are simply many migrants. Then you would also more easily have networks that consist of many migrants. Okay. Another point that is important is that these latter groups received more prejudice, received more discrimination by natives, which hindered the formation of personal relationships with them. Miriam, a young Moroccan woman who just also finished high school, she said, I used to feel I belonged here. In school, they always told me, you're from here, you're Catalan. But now she says that many people who are Moroccan but don't know anything about Morocco and who only have a Moroccan name are rejected for jobs, right? I call you. And she says, they make you feel Moroccan. There are people who don't let you feel Catalan. To me, nobody ever said anything, but you just know they talk badly about Moroccans or about the culture, and I'm Moroccan, and it makes me feel bad, you know? So this also hinders the formation of relationships. Of course, to create relationships with natives, you need 2 people, not just you as a migrant, but also the other person needs to be interested and open to new relationships. if we look at the larger changes of what we could call integration, right? So the larger changes in composition, then we saw that they actually were a byproduct of life events. So usually the bigger changes in personal networks happened when people had a certain life event going on. For example, they had children, they married, they had a transition from school to work. Because these life events introduce new network needs or new meeting contexts, or they eliminate older meeting contexts. Social integration is influenced by the initial placement in society, by prejudice, and also by life events. So does that mean that there is no active networking taking place? Well, yes, actually people also networked. For example, we saw that with Elena, who maintained a relationship with her former boss to keep the option of remigration open. We also saw that many people joined association or language classes, although of course language classes usually put you into contact with other migrants. They also maintained an effort to visit people in their country of origin. In one case, we saw an Argentinian man who avoided his compatriots in the country of residence to actually get to know more Spanish people. That may be a strategy, but of course, in his case, also it was possible because he had access to many Spanish people. Network members also have their own active networking taking place, and that also affects your relationships, of course. Sometimes, for example, one person in the family was taking the role of the kinkeeper, so to speak, so maintained a relationship with other members and kept the informant informed about the family life, which makes it easier for migrants to maintain the contact with the whole family. Also, of course, actively maintaining contact with the informant. And also what happened a lot was that people in the country of origin exerted pressure on the informants to give them some help. And this sometimes also alienated them a little bit from the country of origin. Okay, so let's now answer our question. The first question was, how do processes of migrant embedding in social systems unfold over time? And what we have found is that these processes are far from linearly evolving. Usually they were bumpy, uneven, and individualized. The second question was, what factors weighed in on the direction or depth of embedding? And here we found that mostly factors go beyond individuals' agency. So first of all, the initial placement in society was important, so the composition of social contexts. The second important thing was life events. We saw that integration was often a byproduct of life events. Now, of course, some life events are an effect of individual agency. For example, having a child is often what people want. But of course, it is not a conscious effort to build a more inclusive network or an investment in future relationships, as this individual agency perspective suggests. Also, relationships are two-sided, which means that you can only form a relationship with people when they are also open to it. We saw that prejudice sometimes got in the way of that. And also, just like our respondents had life events, their network members also had life events. They also moved, they had children, they married, and so on. And this also affected the relationships. And last, relationships are also inherently unstable. So sometimes they change. And that drives changes in personal networks, small changes, but still. For example, many weak ties simply don't develop into strong ties in the end. They just disappear, or they maintain weak, but they don't develop into strong ties. And it is important to also note that all these things that I've been telling are actually quite similar to the native population. So if you think about your own network, you will actually recognize most of these things as well for yourself. In our research, we haven't looked explicitly at people who had undocumented status, but it has a big effect on the network. So I'd like to dedicate some words to that based on the research, recent research of other researchers. The first finding is that structures of opportunity, such as participation in the labor market, permanent housing, are severely limited by legal status, which drives people to severe isolation. Second, among Iraqi refugees in Jordan, Arar found that people often practice what she calls strategic anonymity. They won't tell people a lot about their lives with the fear of being deported. Deportations also weaken social capital, not just of the person who is undocumented, but also of the wider community. Each deportation is actually, taking out a node of the community network. This is a result by Hagan et al. And last, power differentials between documented citizens and undocumented migrants in the US often reproduce the legal violence of the state, as a difference in status puts documented citizens in a positions where they can abuse, exploit, or demean their undocumented partners, families, and friends. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Some thoughts for policy are that integration is a two-way process. It is acknowledged to be a two-way process, but it's in policy, this idea often gets a little bit lost. Policies need to reflect that. If a person says that immigrants don't integrate, but he or she does not have any immigrant friends, him or herself, then it means they are not integrating either. And so maybe more policy efforts should be dedicated also to the native population, to making sure that they also have the incentives to mix and mingle. Also, migrants can be more involved into policy making. One thing that we saw, and that some others have found as well, is that schools have an important function for integration, not just for the children, but also for the parents, especially mothers. And it may be a domain where, with more effort, relationships can be created horizontally between parents. Right? So what we see is that the EU is focusing particularly on associations, cultural associations, sports associations, social associations, but there are some other contexts that may be even more relevant than those are. And last, as I said, maybe we should also develop policies for undocumented migrants. Maybe they are not supposed to stay long, but they are here and they are vulnerable as well. Some thoughts for research. First, the same as for policies. Integration is a two-way process. Let's do research in a way that reflects that. We always focus on migrant networks, but we should just as well focus on the networks of the majority population and see to what extent they are integrating with migrants. Understand which people, for example, mix more than others, and what it is that makes them mix more. Second, more generally, more research is needed on the network formation of the general population. So we have a tendency to always focus as personal network researchers on specific populations, migrants, the elderly, young mothers, but we also need first some basic knowledge about what network formation looks like for the general population in order to also see how migrants or other people deviate from these patterns. I would also like to mention the danger of focusing on network constellations cross-sectionally. By looking at constellations cross-sectionally, embeddedness becomes an individual affair. Some migrants are more integrated or more successful than others, but we don't know why, or we misinterpret why because we look at individual variables. An important point, as Mario Small already indicated, is that when we do network research, we should think of the settings in which these networks are created and think of whether their rules and norms inhibit or encourage relationship formation. And the last thought is that as researchers, we need to reflect more on our own assumptions and categories. We are socialized as well within a system that has certain assumptions, and we often adopt them without really thinking about them, right? But we must think about the assumptions and categories that we put into research. Do they make any sense or not? Okay, this is all. The work that I have been presenting is forthcoming in these two publications. These are the publications that I've mentioned. I just want to have them in the video here as well. And thank you for listening. Let me end with this quote of a poem by Warsan Shir, who said, "You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." And I think that this is a very good quote for the increasingly negative migration debates. Thank you for listening.